Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The diplomatic banquet was already a disaster, and Noah had barely touched his drink. The Zarin embassy was a marvel of alien architecture, towering crystalline pillars, gravity-defying chandeliers, and entire walls that shimmered with iridescent colors depending on who was looking at them. It was meant to be an impressive display, but for Noah, it was just another reminder that humans didn't belong here. He adjusted the stiff collar of his formal uniform, forcing a polite smile as he nodded to the alien dignitaries. The room buzzed with soft conversation, hushed whispers in Zarin dialects, and the faint tinkling of glasses filled with something that smelled a little too sweet to be safe for human consumption. His job was simple: represent Earth, shake hands, make diplomatic small talk, and ensure that the growing alliance between humans and Exer didn't implode over minor cultural misunderstandings. Simple, or at least it was supposed to be. Noah, keep your movements precise. Ambassador Calloway's voice crackled through the earpiece discreetly hidden behind his collar. Zarins interpret unnecessary gestures as nervousness, and for God's sake, do not touch anyone's tail. Right, the tails. Zens weren't just humanoid. Their most defining feature was the long, prehensile tail each one possessed, graceful, expressive, and highly sensitive. He'd read the reports. The tail was more than just an appendage. It was a social indicator, a status marker, and most importantly, a bonding organ. Zens didn't touch each other's tails casually. They didn't even let others brush against them unless there was an established connection. Noah exhaled slowly, careful not to let his anxiety show. He'd gotten through worse situations. He could survive one dinner. That was before he met her. She was standing across the room, effortlessly poised, talking to a cluster of high-ranking Zarin officials. She had the smooth jade-green skin of her people, her features sharp but undeniably elegant. Her deep violet eyes flicked around the room with an intensity that suggested she saw everything, including him. And then there was her tail. It flicked lazily behind her, curling and uncurling in slow, absent motions like she was deep in thought. It was mesmerizing in a way he hadn't expected. "That's Lady Nexa," a voice murmured near him. Noah glanced to his side, recognizing the speaker as another human diplomat, Henderson, if he remembered correctly. "Daughter of Lord Ville, nobility highly respected," the man's lips quirked, "and dangerous." Noah frowned, defined dangerous. "She doesn't take kindly to rejection." Before he could respond, movement caught his eye. Nexa had turned her gaze directly toward him. There was something unreadable in her expression, curiosity, maybe? Amusement. Before he could decide, she was already striding toward him, the crowd parting effortlessly for her. His heart definitely didn't skip a beat. "Human ambassador," she greeted, her voice smooth, regal, but not unkind. Noah nodded. "Lady Nexa, it's an honor." Her lips curled slightly at that, and she tilted her head, studying him like a puzzle she hadn't quite solved yet. "You've been observing me." It wasn't a question. Noah resisted the urge to shift on his feet. "I observe everyone. It's part of my job." A small hum of amusement left her throat. "And what have you determined about me?" "Sharp," he answered honestly. "Watchful, you don't waste words." Her tail flicked at the observation, and for a moment he thought he saw approval in her eyes. "Perhaps," she admitted, then with a slight tilt of her head, "Tell me, Ambassador, do humans dance?" The question caught him off guard. "We do." "Good." Without warning, she reached forward, closing the small space between them. Noah barely had a second to react before something warm brushed against his wrist. Her tail, it had coiled around him in a single fluid motion, light, almost delicate at first, but then it tightened. A sharp inhale left him as he registered what just happened. The entire room went silent. Nexa froze, her fingers twitching as she realized it too. A heartbeat passed, then another. Then slowly her grip didn't loosen. Murmurs started rippling through the crowd. He could feel the stares drilling into him. This wasn't just an accident. This wasn't nothing. Nexa's tail had marked him. Noah's stomach dropped. What just happened? he asked, voice lower now, controlled. She didn't let go. If anything, her tail curled even tighter. She swallowed, looking him in the eye. It seems I have just claimed you. Silence stretched between them. Noah could barely hear past the blood rushing in his ears. Claimed me? He echoed, numb. Her tail was still wrapped around his wrist, an unbreakable Zirin bond. He barely registered the way Ambassador Calloway was hissing in his earpiece, panic laced through her voice. Noah, she whispered, voice barely concealing her horror, do not make a scene. Oh, it was already too late for that. Nexa finally exhaled, her expression carefully neutral, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. This wasn't something she had planned. This wasn't a trick, but it didn't matter because the bond was sealed. The whispers in the room were growing louder now. Zirin nobles watched with open curiosity, some of them even murmuring to one another with amused intrigue. And then one voice cut through the rest. Lord Vale, Nexa's father. The elder Zion stepped forward, his imposing frame radiating authority, his piercing gaze locked onto Noah's wrist, then slowly traveled to his daughter's face. His voice was calm, but the weight behind it was suffocating. Nexa, he said, his tone carrying across the room, explain yourself. Noah felt her tail flex involuntarily, an instinctual response. She didn't waver, didn't look away. It was an accident, she admitted, but then she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. But the bond is real, and I will not break it. Noah swore under his breath. This wasn't just a diplomatic misunderstanding anymore. This was a full-scale interstellar crisis, and worse, it was his crisis now. The silence in the embassy hall stretched unbearably. Every Zarin noble in the room was watching them, waiting for the fallout of what had just happened. Noah could feel Nexa's tail still coiled around his wrist, a physical reminder of the disaster unfolding before him. He had been in negotiations, firefights, and tense diplomatic standoffs before, but nothing had ever been this precarious. One wrong move, one misplaced word, and he could trigger an interstellar incident. Nexa's father, Lord Vale, stepped forward, his violet eyes unreadable, but his presence was suffocating. You will not break the bond, he repeated Nexa's words, his tone devoid of emotion. Is that your final decision? Noah felt a cold sweat forming at the back of his neck. He barely knew Zirin customs, but he knew this was serious. He glanced at Nexa, hopping, praying that she would offer a way out of this. She didn't. Instead, she squared her shoulders, her tail not loosening, not backing down. I will not dishonor it, she said, firm but composed. A ripple went through the gathered nobles. Some of them looked pleased, others less so. Lord Vale's gaze flickered to Noah, assessing him like he was an inconvenient puzzle piece that had just landed in the middle of a high-stakes political game. Human, he said, his voice dangerously measured, do you understand what has just happened? Noah swallowed. Not really, but this wasn't the moment to admit ignorance. I understand that an accident has led to an unexpected situation, he said carefully, keeping his voice even, and that it carries significant cultural importance. That seemed to satisfy some of the watching Zens, but not Vale. He stepped even closer. An accident, he echoed, voice dipping lower. There are no accidents when it comes to Zirin bonds. His gaze sharpened. Your touch has been accepted. Our biology has already started forming the connection. Noah resisted the urge to curse under his breath. Then there must be a way to reverse it, he said, keeping his tone diplomatic. Nexa stiffened beside him, her tail giving a sharp, involuntary twitch before tightening again. Lord Vale's expression didn't change, but Noah caught the flicker of something in his gaze. Are you rejecting my daughter? The room immediately fell into tense silence. A single wrong word would undo everything. Noah gritted his teeth. I'm saying I need to understand the situation before making any decisions. Nexa's grip didn't loosen. If anything, it got tighter. He glanced at her, finding her expression composed, but her tail betrayed her emotions. Something in his stomach twisted. She wasn't just being stubborn. This bond meant something to her. Then you will learn, Vale said simply. Immediately, without another word, he turned, making a sharp motion with his hand. The Zirin guards flanking the room stepped forward, not aggressively but with clear expectation. Noah didn't resist. He wasn't stupid. He had no leverage here. He let out a slow breath and glanced at Nexa. "I'm assuming you're coming with me." Her tail gave a subtle flick, almost amused despite the weight of the situation. "I don't have much of a choice." Neither of them did. The private chamber they were taken to was far more ornate than Noah expected for what was essentially a diplomatic holding cell. The walls shimmered with Zirin bioluminescence, casting a soft glow across the curved furniture. A large window overlooked the distant city skyline, but Noah wasn't focused on the view. He was focused on Nexa. Her tail had finally uncoiled from his wrist, but he could still feel the phantom pressure. She stood near the window, arms crossed, tail flicking subtly, a zir and tell for agitation. "All right," Noah exhaled, rubbing his wrist. "You want to tell me exactly what just happened back there?" She turned, her violet eyes analyzing him again. "You touched my tail," she said simply. He stared. "Yeah, I got that part." Nexa's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "It's not just about contact, Noah." She hesitated, then exhaled. "Zirin tails are designed for connection. The moment you touched mine, my body recognized you as compatible. My tail responded before I could stop it." He frowned, "And that's all it takes." She lifted a brow. "For humans, maybe that seems trivial. For us, it's different. The bond isn't just ceremonial, it's biological." Noah was starting to feel the weight of what she was saying. "So you're telling me," he said slowly, "that your body decided I'm your mate before your brain had a say in it?" A flicker of something crossed her face. "Yes," she admitted, "and that decision is not so easily undone." He ran a hand down his face. "Great, just great." Silence stretched between them. Nexa's tail flicked sharply, an obvious sign of frustration. "You make it sound like the worst thing in the galaxy." Noah snorted. "Forgive me if I'm not thrilled about getting married at a dinner party." Her eyes flashed. "It's not marriage," she corrected, "not yet." He blinked. "What?" She let out a slow breath as if choosing her next words carefully. "The bond is still in its early stages," she explained. "It strengthens over time. If neglected, it can fade." That caught his attention. "So there is a way to break it." Nexa hesitated. "Yes," she admitted, "but it's not simple or fast." Noah latched onto that. "Define not fast." She exhaled. "Months, possibly longer." His stomach sank. "You're kidding." "I don't joke about this," she said flatly. Noah muttered another curse, raking a hand through his hair. He didn't have months to navigate an unwanted bond with an alien noblewoman. Nexa watched him, expression unreadable. Then, softer than before, she asked, "Do you truly despise the idea so much?" He looked at her, really looked at her. She was standing stiffly, shoulders squared, tail betraying nervous energy. For all her confidence back in the banquet hall, there was a tension in her posture now, a hint of uncertainty she hadn't shown before. "No," he said. "I don't know you and you don't know me. We didn't choose this." She studied him for a long moment, then finally nodded. "That much we can agree on." Another silence, but this time it wasn't quite as hostile. Then the door slid open. Lord Vil stepped in, his presence commanding the space immediately. His gaze swept over both of them before settling on Noah. "Your people have been informed of the situation," he said, voice carefully neutral, "and we have reached a decision." Noah tensed. "What decision?" Vil folded his hands behind his back. "For the next 30 days, you and Nexa will remain together. You will learn our customs. You will prove whether this bond is truly a mistake," his gaze sharpened, "or something more." Noah tensed. 30 days with her. He wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a death sentence. Noah stared at Lord Vil, feeling the weight of the Zarin noble's words settle into his chest like a lead weight. 30 days. He wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a death sentence. His instinct was to argue, to push back against this ridiculous situation, but he could already tell that wouldn't get him anywhere. The way Vale spoke, the way the guards stood at attention, the way Nexa's tail remained still, All of it told him that this wasn't a negotiation. His superiors had agreed to this, which meant Earth wasn't willing to risk offending the Xer over something they saw as a minor inconvenience. Minor inconvenience? Yeah, right. Noah exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay composed. And if, at the end of these 30 days, the bond isn't stronger? Vale's sharp gaze didn't waver. Then it will be formally dissolved and you will be free to leave. Simple, clean. Except nothing about this was actually simple. Noah cast a sideways glance at Nexa, expecting some level of resistance from her, but she remained calm, no argument, no protest. That bothered him. He had assumed she would fight for this, for the bond, for her people's customs. Yet now she just stood there, composed, accepting of this temporary arrangement. That meant one of two things. Either she had already expected this outcome, or she had already decided how this would end. Before he could ask, Vale stepped closer, his expression unreadable. I will assign attendants to assist you in understanding our ways, a pause, and to ensure compliance. Because, of course, there would be watchful eyes. This wasn't just about the bond. This was a political maneuver, a way for the Zerns to test human adaptability, patience, and commitment to interspecies relations. Noah hated being a pawn, but he had no choice. He inclined his head slightly, the closest thing to agreement he was willing to give. Understood. Vil nodded once, satisfied, before turning his attention to Nexa. You will see to it that the ambassador learns what is expected of him. Nexa inclined her head. Of course. With that, Vale turned and left, the guards following him out of the chamber, leaving only the two of them behind. The door slid shut. Silence settled. Noah exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Well, he muttered, that was fun. Nexa, to her credit, looked entirely unbothered. It could have been worse. He scoffed, oh, how exactly? She tilted her head slightly, as if considering. They could have insisted on immediate binding rituals or put you through the formal trials. He narrowed his eyes. Define formal trials. A flicker of amusement touched her lips. Physical and mental tests of compatibility, not all of them are pleasant. Yeah, that didn't sound promising. He sighed, packing toward the large window. The city outside was beautiful in its own way, glowing softly under the endless sky. Ziran architecture was a stark contrast to human designs. For all the tension of the situation, there was something almost peaceful about the view. Almost. So, he said after a moment, turning back to Nexa, you agreed to this pretty fast. She didn't immediately answer. Instead, she watched him, her tail flicking once. Would you rather I fought for permanence? He hesitated. The question was too direct, too calculated, and it forced him to acknowledge something he hadn't really considered yet. She didn't want this either, or at least not in the way he had assumed. He had pictured her as rigid, bound by tradition, unwilling to let go of a sacred Ziran custom. But if that were true, she would have argued against the 30-day rule. She would have insisted the bond remain, that he submit to the Ziran way. Instead, she had been patient, measured. And that meant something. Noah exhaled. No, I guess not. She nodded, seemingly satisfied with that answer. Then let's make this as painless as possible. Gladly. A brief silence stretched between them before Nexa finally moved toward the console on the wall, tapping in a command. A moment later, a soft chime sounded, and a voice filtered through the room's speakers. Summon attendants, she said, smooth and authoritative. I want a full briefing prepared for the ambassador and ensure that accommodations are arranged. Noah crossed his arms. Accommodations. Nexa's tail twitched in amusement. If we are to spend 30 days together, you will need proper quarters. A shared space is expected. He stared, hold on shared space. She arched a brow. Would you prefer to sleep in the hallways? That's not, he stopped himself, sighing. Fine, whatever, just no weird Zarin sleep customs I need to know about. Another flicker of amusement, nothing alarming. Somehow he wasn't reassured. The door slid open again, and two Zarin attendants entered, their posture crisp, their expressions neutral. One of them taller, older, with an air of practiced formality, bowed slightly. We are honored to serve during this bonding period. Noah had to physically stop himself from reacting. Bonding period, just great. The other attendant, younger, glanced at Nexa. Shall we prepare a formal announcement? Noah's stomach dropped. What announcement? Nexa turned to him, completely unfazed. Our pairing must be acknowledged. Oh, for the love of, Noah said quickly. No announcements, the less people know, the better. The attendants exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to respond to a human interfering with Zarin customs. But Nexa, she smirked. Very well, she said, no announcements. Something about the way she said it made him feel like he had just lost a battle he didn't know he was fighting. The attendants nodded and left, leaving them alone again. Noah sighed. I get the feeling you're enjoying this way too much. Her tail flicked. You're an intriguing case, Ambassador. That's a polite way of saying I'm a mess, isn't it? She smiled, actually smiled. I suppose we'll find out. Noah ran a hand through his hair, already regretting every choice that had led him to this moment. 30 days. He was never going to survive this. Noah woke to the sound of something shifting nearby. For a split second, his instincts kicked in, years of training and high-risk negotiations, and dangerous off-world assignments telling him that any unfamiliar noise in an unfamiliar place was a problem. Then he remembered, he wasn't on a mission. He wasn't in danger. He was in the Zuran embassy, trapped in an accidental mate bond with an alien noblewoman and stuck in this ridiculous arrangement for the next 30 days. Great. Rubbing a hand over his face, he exhaled and pushed himself up. The Zion sleeping quarters were surprisingly comfortable, too comfortable, actually. The bed was larger than any standard human design, the sheets a strange but weirdly pleasant fabric that adjusted to body temperature. The room itself was minimalist, sleek, with the walls giving off a faint bioluminescent glow instead of artificial lighting. And across the room, Nexa. She stood near a set of floating holoscreens, her posture straight, tail idly flicking behind her as she scanned whatever information was displayed in front of her. If she noticed him waking up, she didn't acknowledge it immediately, which suited Noah just fine. He had a lot to process before he dealt with her again. Stretching, he got to his feet, rolling the tension out of his shoulders. So, what's the schedule today? He asked, voice rough from sleep. Nexa glanced at him. Lessons. He blinked. Lessons. She turned fully, crossing her arms. You wish to dissolve the bond, do you not? He hesitated. Yeah. Then you must learn. Zirin customs, Zirin laws, Zirin bureaucracy. He exhaled, already exhausted. And what exactly do these lessons include? Everything you need to know about our customs, etiquette, and expectations. A slight pause, including the role of a bonded mate. He stared. Come again. She arched a brow, completely unbothered. Regardless of how temporary this arrangement is, you must still adhere to formalities. If you fail to meet even the basic expectations, it will reflect poorly not just on you, but on the entire human delegation. Noah felt the trap she was laying, and he hated that he had no way out of it. You're saying if I screw up, it'll make Earth look bad. I'm saying that carelessness in matters of cultural diplomacy can have consequences. He gritted his teeth. Right, and I suppose you're the one who gets to teach me. Who else? Fantastic. Pinching the bridge of his nose, he muttered. At least tell me there's breakfast first. Nexa's tail twitched in amusement. There is. Small victories. The training hall was nothing like what Noah expected. For one, it wasn't actually a hall. It was more of an open-air chamber enclosed by shimmering force fields instead of physical walls. Soft golden light filtered through the high ceilings, casting a glow over the elegant minimalistic design. And of course, they weren't alone. A group of Zarin attendants stood at the far side of the space, watching with composed expressions, not interfering, not interrupting, just observing. Because of course this wasn't just about learning. This was a test. Nexa stood in front of him, arms crossed, tail curled loosely around her wrist in thought. For today, she said, we will begin with basic etiquette, greetings, formal gestures, social expectations. Noah groaned. I was really hopping for combat training instead. She gave him a look. Do you intend to fight your way out of this? No, he admitted, but at least getting punched in the face is more straightforward. A flicker of amusement passed through her eyes before she regained her usual composure. Noted. However, today we focus on protocol. He sighed. All right, fine, lay it on me. She stepped forward. First, how do you believe you should greet a Zarin noble of higher status? He considered. A bow. Incorrect. Noah frowned. A handshake. She looked offended. Absolutely not. Okay, well, you're not giving me a lot of options here. Nexa sighed and took another step forward. Among Zurins, deference is shown through posture. You must tilt your head slightly to the side, exposing the neck, just a fraction. Noah stared. You're joking. I assure you I am not. He exhaled sharply, muttering under his breath. Great, expose my throat like I'm a submissive house cat. Love that. Nexa's tail twitched again. Would you prefer I demonstrate? Knock yourself out. She stepped closer, tilting her head ever so slightly, her posture graceful yet deliberate. The movement was subtle, but he could see the intent behind it, controlled vulnerability, a silent way of saying, I acknowledge your status. Then she straightened. Now you. Noah hesitated. This was ridiculous, but he also knew that fighting it would only make this worse. Gritting his teeth, he mimicked the motion, tilting his head just slightly. Nexa studied him. After a moment, she nodded. Acceptable. He let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Glad to hear it. You'll need to practice it until it's instinctual. Of course I do. She stepped back, moving on to the next lesson. The rest of the training went about as painfully as expected. He learned how to properly stand during formal Zarin gatherings, precise posture, hands loosely at the sides, tail positioning if applicable, which obviously it wasn't. He learned how to refuse an offer without unintentionally implying mortal offense, never use direct negatives, always phrase as a polite redirection. He even learned how to properly hold a Zurin ceremonial drinking vessel, which apparently had its own specific etiquette. By the end of it, Noah's brain hurt. Tell me something, he said as they wrapped up, stretching his arms behind his head. Are all these customs actually taken this seriously, or do you just enjoy making humans suffer? Nexa's lips twitched, not quite a smirk, not quite a smile. Both. Noah groaned, fantastic. They made their way back toward the embassy's main halls, attendants trailing behind them at a respectful distance. You did well, Nexa admitted after a moment. He glanced at her, caught off guard. Is that a compliment? A factual observation. He rolled his eyes. I'll take what I can get. As they walked, a thought nagged at the back of his mind. This whole day had been tolerable, which honestly was unexpected. Nexa was less of a nightmare than he'd anticipated. Sure, she was demanding, sharp, and had a habit of enjoying his suffering, but she was also methodical, patient, and not as cold as she pretended to be. Which was a problem because if he wasn't careful, he might actually start liking her. And that would make the next 29 days a lot more complicated. Noah had barely sat down in his quarters when the door chimed again. He groaned. I swear, if this is another lesson on how not to offend alien nobility, I'm jumping out the window. The door slid open and Nexa stepped inside, arms crossed, her tail flicking once behind her. I assume that's a human exaggeration. Mostly, he muttered, rubbing his face. What now? She took a measured step forward, looking far too composed for someone who had spent hours drilling him on Zurin etiquette. You've made progress, she admitted. Wow, 2 compliments in one day. Careful, Nexa, I might think you actually approve of me. Her lips twitched in something close to amusement. I said progress, that is not the same as approval. Noah smirked. I'll take what I can get. She regarded him for a moment, then gestured toward the holoscreen embedded in the wall. A soft, glowing interface flickered to life, displaying a list of upcoming events, all of which, unfortunately, had his name attached. Noah squinted. What is this? Your schedule, she said. He frowned. I thought my schedule was try not to embarrass myself for 30 days. That is the general goal, she agreed, but you also have obligations. He scanned the list: formal dinner with Zion delegates, cultural exchange forum, a bonded pair ceremony. He froze. Hold on, bonded pair ceremony? What the hell is that? Nexa tilted her head slightly, as if waiting for this reaction. A public demonstration of our bond. Noah blinked. That sounds a lot like a wedding. It isn't, she said smoothly. It's an official recognition of the arrangement. He stared at her. That's worse. Nexa's tail curled absently, a subtle sign of mild amusement. It's tradition. You and your traditions are going to kill me, Noah muttered, dragging a hand through his hair. She stepped closer, her violet eyes steady. This is not an official binding, she clarified. It is merely a formalized statement of intent. He sighed. And if I refuse? She didn't hesitate. Then it will be seen as a rejection of the bond. Noah gritted his teeth. This was exactly why he hated politics, and I assumed that would damage relations between our species. Severely. Great, fantastic. So what exactly happens during this ceremony? Nexa considered for a moment before answering. We stand before the council, acknowledge the bond, and affirm our commitment to the arrangement for the duration of the agreement. That's it. She hesitated. Noah's stomach dropped. There's a gesture of affirmation, she said carefully. He didn't like that phrasing at all. Define gesture. She met his gaze evenly. A tail rap. Noah blinked. A what? She sighed, as if explaining this to a particularly slow student. You will stand beside me. I will wrap my tail around your wrist. He let out a slow breath. That's it. Yes. He studied her, searching for any sign that she was downplaying the importance of this, but Nexa was damn good at keeping her expressions neutral. Still, his instincts were screaming that this was a bigger deal than she was letting on. And yet, what choice did he have? If rejecting the ceremony meant offending the Xer, then he was trapped. Again. He groaned. Fine, I'll do it. Nexa nodded, satisfied, but as she turned to leave, he couldn't help but ask, This isn't permanent, right? She paused at the door, glancing over her shoulder. Not yet. And with that, she was gone. The ceremony hall was grand, too grand for something Noah kept telling himself was temporary. Golden light streamed through high arched ceilings, the walls lined with intricate Zirin carvings. The council stood in a semicircle formation, their violet eyes unreadable as they watched him and Nexa approach. The weight of their gazes was suffocating. Nexa, of course, was perfectly composed. Her movements were smooth, controlled, effortless. Meanwhile, Noah felt like a fish out of water, every step a reminder that he didn't belong here. And then they stopped in the center of the hall. A single Zerin noble stepped forward, their long ceremonial robe flowing behind them. The bond has been formed, the noble said, their voice deep, resonant. Do you stand before us in recognition of it? Nexa tilted her head slightly. I do. Noah swallowed. Just play along. I do, he echoed. A ripple of approval murmured through the gathered nobles. Then came the moment he had been dreading. Nexa's tail curled toward him, smooth and deliberate. It brushed against his wrist, cool against his skin, before slowly wrapping around him. The movement was fluid, natural, and far more intimate than he had anticipated. Noah kept his expression blank, but he could feel it. The weight of her tail, the warmth of her skin, the strange, unspoken connection forming between them. It was too much, but at the same time, not enough. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Then the bond is affirmed, the noble declared. For the next 30 days, you shall walk this path together. Noah barely heard the rest because as Nexa's tail tightened slightly, just for a brief second, he swore he felt something more than just ceremonial obligation, something real. And that was dangerous, because if he wasn't careful, he might start believing in it. Noah sat at the edge of the ceremonial platform, staring at the distant Zurin skyline. The ceremony had gone exactly as planned, no disruptions, no unexpected diplomatic crises, but the weight of it still settled heavy on his shoulders. The bond was official now, even if it wasn't permanent, even if he still had a way out. There was something undeniable about the way Nex's tail had wrapped around his wrist. Not just a formality, not just an empty gesture. It had meant something, and that was what bothered him the most. "You look troubled," Nex's voice broke through his thoughts.